vanishing folklore and beliefs. Russian fairy tales from the scéalta of Folkloric, public domain reading circa 1901. Verlioka. There was once a time where there was an old man and an old woman, and they had 2 orphan grandchildren so lovely, gentle, and good, that the old man and the old woman could not love them enough. The old man once took it into his head to go out into the fields with his grandchildren to look at the peas, and they saw that their peas were growing splendidly. The old man rejoiced at the sight with his grandchildren and said, "Well now, you won't find peas like that in the whole world. By and by we'll make caillte out of it and bake us some pea cakes." And next morning the grandfather sent the eldest grandchild and said, "Go and drive away the sparrows from the peas." The grandchildren sat down beside the peas, shook a dry branch, and kept on saying, "Wish, wish, sparrows, ye have pecked at grandfather's peas till you're quite full." And all at once she heard a rumbling and a roaring in the wood. And Verlioka came, huge of stature, with one eye, a hooked nose, ragged stubbly hair, moustaches half an ell long, swine's bristles on his head, hobbling on one leg in a wooden boot, leaning on a crutch and grinding all his teeth and smiling. He went up to the pretty little grandchild, seized her and dragged her away with him behind the lake. The grandfather waited and waited, but there was no grandchild, and he sent his young grandson after her. Verlioka walked off with him also. The grandfather waited and waited and said to his wife, "How very late are our grandchildren! I suppose they are running about there and idling their time away, or catching starlings with some lads or other. And meanwhile the sparrows are looting our peas. Go along, old woman, and teach them some sense." The old woman rose from the stove, took her stick from the corner, gave the pasties another turn, went away, and never came back. As soon as Verlioka saw her in the field, he cried, "What dost thou want here, old hag? Hast thou come hither to shell peas? Then I'll make thee stand here among the peas forever and ever." Then he set to work belabouring her with his crutch, till little by little her very soul oozed out of her, and she lay upon the field, more dead than alive. The grandfather waited in vain for his grandchildren and his old wife, and began to scold at them. "Where on earth have they got to?" said he. "'Tis a true saying that a man must expect no good from his ribs." Then the old man himself made his way to the peas, and saw the old woman lying on the ground in such a battered condition that he scarcely knew her, and of his grandchildren there were no trace. The grandfather cried aloud. He picked up the old woman and dragged her home by degrees, and gradually brought her to with a little cold water. She opened her eyes at last and told the grandfather who it was that had beaten her so, and dragged her grandchildren away from the field. The grandfather was very wroth with Verlioka, and said, "This is too much of a joke. Wait a bit, friend. We also have weapons of our own. Look to thyself, Verlioka, and take care that I don't twist thy mustaches for thee. Thou hast done this thing with thy hand, and thou shalt pay for it with thy head." And as the old grandmother did not hold him back, the grandfather seized his iron crutch and went off to seek Verlioka. He went on till he came to a little pond, and in the pond was swimming a bob-tailed drake. He saw the grandfather and cried, "Tuck, tuck, tuck, tuck! Live for 100 years, old granddad. I have been waiting for thee a long time." "Hail to thee also, drake. Why hast thou been awaiting me?" "Well, I know that thou art in quest of thy grandchildren, and art going to Verlioka to settle accounts with him. And how dost thou come to know of this monster?" "Tuck, tuck, tuck!" screeched the drake. "I have good cause to know him. 'Twas he who docked my tail. Then canst thou show me his dwelling?" "Tuck, tuck, tuck!" screeched the drake. "Here am I but a tiny little bird, but I'll have my tail's worth out of him, I know. Wilt thou go on before and show me the way? I see thou hast a good noddle of thy own, though thou art bob-tailed." Then the drake came out of the water and climbed up on the bank, waddling from side to side. They went on, and they came upon a little bit of cord lying in the road, and it said, "Hail, little grandtide! Hail, little granddad! Wise pate! Hail, little cord! Where dost thou dwell, and whither dost thou wander?" "I live in such and such a place. I am going to pay off Verlioka. He has beaten my old woman and carried off my 2 grandchildren, and such splendid grandchildren too. Take me, that I may help." The grandfather thought, "I may as well take it. It will do to hang Verlioka with." Then he said to the little cord, "Come along with us, if thou dost know the way." And the little cord wriggled after them, just as if it were a little tapering snake. They went on, and they saw lying in the road a little water-mill, and it said to them, "Hail, little granddad, wise pate! Hail, little water-mill! Where dost thou dwell, and whither dost thou wander?" "I live in such and such a place, and I am going to settle accounts with Verlioka. Just fancy, he has beaten my old woman and carried off my grandchildren, and such splendid grandchildren too. Take with me, that I may help." And the grandfather thought, "The water-mill may be of use as well." Then the water-mill raised itself up, pressed against the ground with its handle, and went along after the grandfather. Again they went on, and in the road lay an acorn, and it said to them in a little squeaky voice, "Hail, Granddad Longnose! Hail, Oaky Acorn! Whither art thou striding away like that?" "I am going to beat Verlioka. Dost know him?" "I should think I did. Take me with thee to help." "But how canst thou help? Don't spit in the well, or thou wilt have to drink up the water thyself." The grandfather thought to himself, "I may as well let him go." So he said to the acorn, "Roll on behind me then." But that was a strange rolling, for the acorn leaped to its feet and frisked along in front of them all. And so they came into a thick forest, a forest most drear and dreadful, and in the forest stood a lonely little hut. Oh, so lonely. There was no fire burning in the stove, and there stood there a fermenty pottage for 6. The acorn, who knew what he was about, immediately leaped into the pottage. The little cord stretched itself out on the threshold. The grandfather placed the little watermill on the bench. The drake sat upon the stove, and the grandfather himself stood in the corner. Suddenly he heard a crashing and a trembling in the wood, and the monstrous Verlioka came along on one leg in a wooden boot, leaning on his crutch and smiling from ear to ear. Verlioka came up to the hut, threw down some firewood on the floor, and began to light the fire in the stove. But the acorn, who was sitting in the pottage, fell a-singing. Pee, 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 to beat Verlioka come we. Verlioka flew into a rage and seized the pot by the handle, but the handle broke, and all the pottage was scattered all over the floor, and the acorn leaped out of the pot and flipped Verlioka in his one eye, so that it was put out entirely. Blinded, Verlioka fell a-shrieking, and fought about the air with his arms, and would have made for the door. But where was the door? He couldn't see it. Then the little cord wound itself about his legs, and he fell on the threshold, and the little watermill on top of him, off the bench. Then the grandfather rushed out of the corner and pitched into him with his iron crutch, and the drake on top of the stove screeched with all of its might, "Tack, tack, 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 tack! Pitch into him! Pitch into him!" Neither his wrath nor his strength was of any good to Verlioka. The grandfather beat him to death with his iron crutch, and after that destroyed his hut and laid bare the dungeon beneath the hut. And out of the dungeon he drew his beloved grandchildren, and dragged all of Verlioka's riches home to his woman. And so he lived and prospered with his old woman and his grandchildren, and plucked and ate his peas in peace and quietness. So there's a skaska for you, and I deserve a cake or two also. If you enjoyed this folktale, please click the subscribe button. Thank you very much for listening. Vanishing folklore and belief.